Okinawa, 1945. During 82 days, the world witnessed one of the most brutal battles of World War II. More than 200,000 soldiers and civilians lost their lives in a conflict characterized by desperation and ruthless fighting. This island, of vital strategic importance, became a scene of horror, where the United States Army and the Japanese Imperial forces faced off in relentless combat. The war tactics proved devastating, with massive bombings and ground assaults turning the landscape into a true hell. But what led these nations to such a destructive confrontation? What decisions were made in high places that sealed the fate of thousands? And what legacy did this conflict leave in the collective memory of humanity? The last door to Japan. As it approached 1945, the conflict in the Pacific Ocean had reached a critical point. Since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the war had evolved into a series of intense battles that wore down both the United States and Japan. The Allied victory at Midway, the capture of Guadalcanal, and the campaign in the Solomon Islands were milestones that led the Japanese Empire to a growing desperation. However, the struggle for control of the Pacific Ocean was far from over. The Battle of Okinawa, known as the last door to Japan, would become a brutal and decisive chapter. Okinawa, the largest island of the Ryukyu, was strategically located just 100 miles off the Japanese coast. Its capture would allow the Allied forces to establish a crucial base for the invasion of the archipelago, an imperative objective following the failure of the air raid on Tokyo and the unyielding resistance of the Japanese forces in the Pacific. The island was not only a launch point for the final offensive, but also a symbol of Japanese resistance, where culture and national pride intertwined with the defense of the homeland. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commander of the United States forces, was an experienced military leader who had served in World War I and led several campaigns in the Pacific. His leadership style combined military rigor with a focus on teamwork. Buckner understood that the battle for Okinawa would not be just a matter of brute force. It would require strategy, coordination, and a deep understanding of the terrain. On the other hand, General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the Japanese forces, embodied the resistance and sacrifice of the Japanese people. With decades of military experience, Ushijima had witnessed Japan's transformation into a military empire. His focus on the defense of Okinawa was based on the belief that the struggle on the island was crucial for the survival of his nation. He was a leader of honor, committed to protecting his country at all costs, with clear orders. The defense of Okinawa would be fierce and without surrender. The battle began on the 1st of April 1945 with a massive amphibious assault by Allied forces. In an unprecedented deployment, more than 150,000 American soldiers landed on the beaches of Okinawa. The first moments were brutal, with Japanese artillery opening fire from fortified positions on the coast. American soldiers faced a hell of fire and destruction at every step. Ushijima had prepared defenses in the hills and mountains of the island, using the rugged terrain to his advantage. The Japanese positions, well fortified and camouflaged, hindered the advance of the Allies. Buckner, aware of the importance of taking control quickly, ordered massive airstrikes and naval bombardments. However, each advance of the American forces encountered a fierce Japanese counteroffensive. The days turned into weeks, and casualties began to accumulate on both sides. The Japanese resistance was tenacious, and each fallen soldier became a symbol of sacrifice. The testimonies of survivors reveal the magnitude of the brutality. It was not just a battle. "It was a struggle for life itself," recalled an American soldier. "The sound of explosions, the screams of my comrades, everything blended into a symphony of horror." As the battle dragged on, the situation became increasingly desperate. Buckner, aware of the need to change his approach, decided to employ siege tactics. Instead of constantly advancing, he began to encircle the Japanese positions, attempting to cut off their supply of resources and weaken their morale. The American forces were advancing slowly, but at a high cost. The Japanese resistance, for its part, showed no signs of weakness. Ushijima, committed to his duty, had ordered that surrender be forbidden. The troops fought with the determination to protect their land until the last breath. The Battle of Okinawa quickly became one of the bloodiest in World War II. For 82 days, Allied and Japanese forces faced off in fierce fighting. Buckner's strategy of using continuous bombardments and attacks on multiple fronts began to pay off. However, Ushijima's resistance remained strong. The Japanese, fighting under increasingly desperate conditions, resorted to guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and night attacks, prolonging the battle. The civilian population of Okinawa suffered immensely during this conflict. With more than 100,000 civilians caught between the fronts, the situation became desperate. Many sought refuge in caves and makeshift hideouts, while others were forced to abandon their homes. Survivor accounts describe heart-wrenching scenes of violence and chaos. "It was as if the world had gone mad," recalled an elderly woman. "We just wanted to survive, but the sound of the bombs never stopped." As the battle progressed towards its climax, the Allies finally managed to capture the capital of Okinawa, Naha, a key strategic point. However, despite this advance, Japanese resistance remained unyielding. Ushijima, aware of the imminent defeat, made the decision to retreat to the final positions in the south of the island, where he prepared for a last confrontation. On the 22nd of June 1945, the United States forces finally succeeded in surrounding the Japanese troops in a series of brutal combats. The battle had left an indelible mark on all those involved, and the human cost was immense. In the context of this struggle, Buckner was killed by a Japanese sniper, a devastating blow for the Allied forces. His death symbolized the sacrifice of many, and his legacy became part of the narrative of the battle. Ushijima, after days of constant struggle, was forced to surrender. His decision not to allow the surrender of his troops had resulted in a devastating loss, but his honor and commitment to his country remained intact. The Battle of Okinawa had ended, but not without leaving a trail of destruction and suffering in its wake. More than 200,000 dead, wounded, and missing were the tragic toll of this confrontation. Okinawa was not just the last gateway to Japan. It also became a symbol of the brutality of war and the human cost of the fight. The lessons learned would resonate in the future, and their impact would be felt in the planning of the invasion of Japan. As the world watched in horror the outcome of the battle, the story of Okinawa was inscribed in the annals of war as a reminder of the cruelty and resilience of the human spirit in times of conflict. Operación Iceberg, El Desembarco. The Iceberg operation, launched on the 1st of April 1945, was a crucial turning point in the Pacific theater during World War II. This amphibious assault, the largest in history, involved the mobilization of more than 600,000 men and a vast fleet of warships, submarines, and aircraft. The invading force, under the command of Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., was preparing to take Okinawa, a strategic stronghold on the route to Japan. The preparation for Operation Iceberg was meticulous. For months, the Allies conducted strategic bombings on the Japanese positions in Okinawa, seeking to weaken the enemy's morale. Intelligence reports revealed that General Mitsuru Ushijima had begun constructing a complex system of fortifications inland on the island. Although information about the resistance on the beaches was scarce and often inaccurate. As the transport ships approached the shores of Okinawa, the support fleet began to bombard Japanese positions. The roar of the cannons echoed over the turquoise waters, while the fighter planes dropped their bombs on the enemy defenses. The Marines, crowded on the decks of the ships, watched anxiously the spectacle of destruction unfolding before them. The initial bombardment was devastating, but it left a sense of uncertainty in the air. What would they expect to find upon landing? Upon landing on the beaches of Okinawa, the American soldiers were surprised to encounter a resistance much lighter than anticipated. Instead of the fortified strongholds they had imagined, they found a desolate and abandoned terrain. Initial reports indicated that Ushijima's strategy had consisted of abandoning the coast, relying on the island's interior defenses to provide a more effective barrier. Many defenders had withdrawn inward, leaving the beaches seemingly unprotected. However, this apparent lack of resistance concealed an imminent danger. As the soldiers advanced inland, they realized the trap that had been set. The battle turned fierce and chaotic. The trench warfare, which had characterized other battlefields of the Pacific, became evident in the hills and valleys of Okinawa. Ushijima had abandoned the coastal defense to concentrate his force on the fortified positions further inland, where a maze of trenches and bunkers awaited the American troops. The soldiers faced an enemy that had meticulously prepared their defenses. As they advanced, the difficult terrain and the determination of the enemy became significant obstacles. The Marines experienced the brutality of war in its most visceral form. The sounds of artillery and Japanese machine guns echoed in the air, while the American troops fought to carve their way through a field of death. Despite being considerably diminished, the Japanese army proved to be a formidable adversary. The resistance they offered was fierce and stubborn, with soldiers willing to fight until the last man. The battle turned into a brutal hand-to-hand combat, where strategy, courage, and determination were tested in every corner of the island. As the days and weeks went by, the fighting became increasingly bloody. The lack of rapid progress on the part of the American forces generated frustration and discouragement. However, the High Command was determined to continue, aware that the capture of Okinawa was crucial for the final assault on Japan. As the fighting intensified, the need for supplies and reinforcements became urgent. General Buckner, facing increasing casualties and hostile terrain, continued pushing to secure the island. Coordination among the different branches of the armed forces became essential. The Navy provided naval support, while the Air Force launched airstrikes to destabilize Japanese positions. With the establishment of new supply lines, American soldiers began to experience a sense of progress, although at a high cost. The battle for Okinawa offered a glimpse into the desperation of war. The atrocities committed by both sides, the suffering of civilians, and the devastation of the landscape became an integral part of the narrative. The images of destroyed villages and the despair of residents caught in the midst of the conflict symbolized the brutality of this campaign. The accounts of survivors, both American and Japanese, began to come to light, revealing the emotional and physical scars that the war left on all those involved. The use of suicidal tactics by Japanese soldiers and their tenacious resistance turned every American advance into a heartbreaking blow. The battle lasted for more than 2 months, and although the American army ultimately managed to take control of the island, the cost was exorbitant. Total casualties exceeded 100,000 between both sides, leaving Okinawa as one of the deadliest battlefields of World War II. As the end of the campaign approached, the fight for Okinawa had left an indelible mark on the collective memory of those who participated in it. Operation Iceberg was not just a military assault, but a representation of the human cost of war. The experience lived in Okinawa illustrated the brutality of modern warfare, and the impact of the battle would resonate in future strategic decisions, including the use of nuclear weapons against Japan. The capture of Okinawa, although considered a strategic victory, became a reminder of the high cost of war. The history of Operation Iceberg is one of heroism, sacrifice, and tragedy, a dark chapter in the history of humanity that testifies to the resilience of the human spirit in times of adversity. The battle for Okinawa transformed into a symbol of struggle and resistance, whose scars would continue to mark future generations. The Typhoon of Steel, the Japanese resistance. The first hours of the American landing in Okinawa were just the prelude to one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific theater. Starting on the 20th of April 1945, the Allied forces, predominantly American, began to land on the southern coast of the island, facing Japanese resistance that had meticulously prepared for combat. The Japanese strategy, under the command of Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, focused on defense in depth, a tactic designed to prolong the conflict and maximize casualties on the invading side. From the beginning, the Japanese resistance was relentless. Ushijima, aware that Okinawa represented his last line of defense, had established an intricate system of trenches, caves, and fortifications that took advantage of the island's rugged terrain. The soldiers of the Japanese Empire, both from the Navy and the Imperial Army, were prepared to fight until their last breath, convinced that their sacrifice was vital to protect their homeland and culture. The American response was immediate and forceful, but the Japanese determination turned every advance into a high human cost. U.S. troops encountered difficult terrain, filled with fortified positions that gave defenders a considerable tactical advantage. The Japanese units, well camouflaged and entrenched, used heavy machine guns, mortars, and snipers, sowing chaos among the Allied ranks. The battle turned into a war of attrition, where every meter gained came at the cost of bloody losses. In this context, kamikazes, suicide pilots who dove against U.S. ships, became a feared and devastating element. Although their use had already been common in earlier stages of the war, in Okinawa it reached a level of intensity that surprised the Allies, who had to remain on constant alert against the threat of suicide air attacks. While the United States forces fought to advance, the civilian population of Okinawa found themselves caught in the crossfire. Many residents, who up until that point had lived in relative peace, were dragged into unimaginable horror. The Japanese authorities, in an attempt to maintain morale and resistance, promoted the idea that the population should stay on the island to help the soldiers. This resulted in indescribable suffering, with entire families caught in the conflict, enduring the consequences of war without having an active role in it. The scarcity of food and supplies, along with the constant threat of bombings, plunged the civilian population into an insurmountable despair. Many lives were lost, not only due to military action, but also because of diseases, hunger, and the trauma of the conflict. The fighting continued for weeks, with both sides suffering significant losses. In this chaotic environment, the figure of Ernie Pyle, a famous war journalist, emerged as a symbol of the sacrifice of American soldiers. Pyle, known for his humanistic narrative style and focus on the everyday life of combatants, had accompanied the troops in various battles of the Pacific. However, on the 10th of April in 1945, while covering events in Okinawa, he was hit by a Japanese bullet, falling on the battlefield and marking a profound loss for his comrades. The death of Ernie Pyle resonated in the morale of the American troops, and his absence was felt in every corner of the front. The journalist had managed to connect with the men on the battlefield, reflecting not only their fears and anxieties, but also their bravery and determination. The sadness over his loss spread among the troops, who saw in him a voice that had given life to their experiences and sufferings. In the midst of the unleashed hell, Pyle's figure became a reminder of the human cost of war and the fragility of life. His legacy endured in the collective memory of the soldiers, who considered him a fallen friend in the struggle. As the battle advanced, the Americans were forced to adapt their tactics. In the face of fierce Japanese resistance, air raids and artillery attacks were implemented to destabilize enemy positions and clear the way for land advancement. The Allied forces began to utilize the terrain to their advantage, flanking Japanese positions and attacking from multiple directions. However, the resistance of Ushijima and his men remained firm, leading the Americans into a fierce struggle, where every territorial conquest came at a high price. The conflict intensified, and the Battle of Okinawa became a microcosm of the brutality of war in the Pacific. The atrocities committed by both sides, although in a different context, reflected the despair and inherent brutality of armed conflicts. In this scenario, the Japanese resistance was defined not only by its tenacity in combat, but also by the conviction that their struggle was a matter of honor, a sacrifice for their country and their people. The civilian population, caught between the resistance of Japanese soldiers and the advance of American forces, faced a heartbreaking reality. Civilians were often considered collateral damage in the conflict, and their stories of suffering were lost among the statistics of military casualties. However, the testimonies of survivors reveal the daily horror that was experienced on the island. Families forced to flee, to hide in dark caves, and to survive with scarce resources, while the roar of battles echoed in the distance. The war transformed Okinawa into a scene of devastation, where human suffering reached unimaginable levels. As the days turned into weeks, the Battle of Okinawa became increasingly brutal. The Japanese resistance, although heroic, was beginning to crumble under the pressure of an enemy that showed no signs of surrender. Ushijima's strategy, focused on defense in depth, was starting to take a devastating toll. Despite the morale of the Japanese troops remaining high, the lack of supplies and the constant pressure from American forces were beginning to affect their ability to resist. Finally, in June 1945, after 82 days of fierce fighting, the American forces managed to capture the last Japanese position in Okinawa. The victory was bitter and costly, with thousands of soldiers fallen on both sides. However, the Japanese resistance had demonstrated its valor and determination, leaving an indelible mark on the collective memory of the war. The impact of the Battle of Okinawa on the history of World War II was profound. The struggle on this island not only marked a crucial point in the Pacific Campaign, but also highlighted the brutality of modern warfare, where resistance, sacrifice, and human suffering became recurring themes. The history of Okinawa is a reminder of the costs of war, a testament to the courage and tenacity of those who fought, and a lament for the lives that were lost along the way. The meat grinder, the Shuri Line, the battle for the Shuri Line, which took place between the 2nd of April and the 29th of June 1945, became a symbol of the brutality of World War II. This formidable fortress, designed by Colonel Jiromichi Yahara, stretched along the hills overlooking Okinawa, serving as a masterpiece of military engineering. With trenches, bunkers, and fortified positions, the Shuri Line was intended to prolong Japanese resistance and inflict the largest possible number of casualties on the enemy. The conflict began with a massive naval bombardment, in which American warships fired thousands of projectiles at Japanese positions. However, the attack did not manage to dismantle the line as anticipated. Despite the might of the artillery, Japanese soldiers largely remained intact, sheltered in an elaborate network of caves and tunnels. This initial resistance foreshadowed the magnitude of the struggle that was to come. Upon reaching the vicinity of the Shuri Line, the American soldiers faced a terrifying reality. The hills they hoped to take quickly turned into nearly impenetrable fortifications. The fight resembled that of World War I, where the advance was measured in meters and casualties mounted with each assault. The men of the 1st Marine Division encountered a determined and well-entrenched enemy, defending each hill with an unusual ferocity. Close-quarters combat tactics dominated the scene, where crossfire, grenades, and hand-to-hand fighting defined the day-to-day. As the days turned into weeks, despair grew among the American troops. The generals began to understand that the war would not be quick or easy. The Shuri Line had become a symbol of sacrifice and resilience, a challenge not only physical but also moral and psychological. Many soldiers, still young, began to question their mission and their own survival. A Marine remembered, "Each day we spent there, we felt that death was all around us. You looked into the eyes of your comrades and knew that not everyone would return home." The struggle for each hill and each cave became an exercise in tenacity and sacrifice. The Americans, pushing forward, frequently found themselves trapped in deadly ambushes. The artillery, which had been a pillar of American military strategy, turned into a double-edged sword, causing collateral damage and increasing frustration and despair. The Shuri Line, far from being a simple line, became a labyrinth of death and destruction. The living conditions for both sides were terrible. The American soldiers faced the scorching heat, a lack of supplies, and an enemy that refused to yield. The scarcity of drinking water was a constant problem, leading many to consume contaminated water, which caused illnesses and further weakened morale. At the same time, the Japanese soldiers fought for their homeland and honor, trapped in their fortifications. The Shuri Line was, for them, a symbol of resistance, but also of despair. Testimonies from captured Japanese soldiers reveal that many felt trapped in a cycle of sacrifice, aware that the war was being lost, but unable to surrender. The fighting intensified as American forces attempted to dismantle the Shuri Line. Each assault was marked by brutal violence and loss. Intelligence reports revealed that American soldiers were suffering significant casualties. More than 20,000 casualties were recorded in the first weeks of the battle, a figure that underscored the human cost of the campaign. The struggle for the Shuri Line became a meat grinder, where the lives of men were lost in a relentless fight. Finally, the Shuri Line was breached, but not without a high price. The Japanese resistance, although weakened, continued until the last moment. Colonel Yahara, in an attempt to save what remained of his army, ordered a retreat, but many soldiers chose to stay and fight until the end. Despair overtook those who knew their days were numbered, and the last battles on the Shuri Line became a spectacle of extreme sacrifice, where men on both sides fought until their last breath. The memories of those dark days remain etched in the collective memory of the survivors. An American veteran reflected years later, "I will never forget what I saw, the struggle, the despair, the sacrifice. In those moments, humanity seems to fade away." Similarly, a captured Japanese soldier commented, "We fought not only for our land, but for our lives. There were moments when death seemed like a relief." The Shuri Line was not just a battlefield. It was a microcosm of war itself. The struggle for every hill and every cave reflected human resilience in the face of adversity. In a broader context, the Battle for Okinawa, and particularly the Shuri Line, marked a turning point in the Pacific War. The brutality of the fighting foreshadowed the human cost of the strategic decisions that would be made in the following months. The battle left scars not only on the land, but also on the men who survived the experience. The sacrifice at the Shuri Line, although tragic, became a reminder of the tenacity of the human spirit. As the American troops finally managed to advance, the memory of those who fell in the fight would endure. The lessons learned in the hell of 82 days would not be easily forgotten. In military history, the Shuri Line stood as a testament to the brutality of war and the deep cost of victory. Ultimately, the battle for the Shuri Line became one of the last and bloodiest confrontations of World War II, leaving an indelible mark on the history of the conflict and on the memory of those who lived it. The last assault, the fall of Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa, which took place between April and June of 1945, stands as one of the most brutal and decisive confrontations of World War II. It not only marked the end of the war in the Pacific, but also unleashed unprecedented human suffering. In the final days of this intense conflict, Japanese forces found themselves in a desperate situation. The resistance, which had been determined, faced overwhelming pressure. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, in command of the Japanese forces, was at a critical crossroads. As the American troops advanced, Ushijima contemplated a strategic retreat to the mountains of the Kiamu Peninsula, where he hoped to regroup his army to launch a final counterattack. This decision, made under the shadow of imminent defeat, reflected the Japanese military culture that valued fighting to the last breath. With the arrival of the monsoon, torrential rains battered the island, transforming the battlefields into impenetrable mud. This adversity complicated the advance of the American troops and made the logistics of supplies for the defenders even more difficult. The weather became both an obstacle and an ally, depending on the side being analyzed. The rains not only complicated military operations, but also intensified the suffering of civilians caught in the middle of the conflict. Many, including elderly, women, and children, sought refuge in caves and tunnels, trying to escape the violence. However, the line between combatants and non-combatants blurred, and civilians found themselves trapped in the crossfire, highlighting the human cost of war. At the end of June, U.S. forces, under the command of Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, had captured key strategic positions. The Kiamu Peninsula had become the last Japanese stronghold, a mountainous terrain that offered tactical advantages. Ushijima, aware that time was running out, ordered a desperate counterattack. driven by the conviction that the Japanese army had to demonstrate its determination to the end. The attack began on 25 of June with a surprising vigor. Despite being decimated, the Japanese troops bravely launched themselves against the American positions, using guerrilla tactics that had proven to be effective in the past. However, the American response was swift and forceful. Superiority in technology and number of troops became evident, and they started to unleash their firepower. The airstrikes and heavy artillery, accumulated throughout the campaign, concentrated on the Kiamu Peninsula. The devastation was indescribable. Witnesses of the time described the landscape as a hell on earth, where the roar of explosions mixed with the cries of the wounded. The American response was relentless, and as they advanced, the Japanese resistance crumbled. Ushijima's forces, trapped and with no possibility of escape, began to suffer devastating losses. In the midst of this carnage, the fight became personal for many soldiers. Testimonies from American veterans reflect that the battle was not just a matter of military strategy, but also of individual survival. One of those soldiers, Sergeant John Smith, remembered, "We were there, in the midst of chaos, and every second mattered. We were not only fighting against the enemy, but also against fear, rain, and mud. Every step forward was a struggle for life." The tragedy of civilians intensified. As the Americans advanced, the Japanese, in a desperate attempt to protect their population, began to use civilians as human shields. This cruel tactic reflected the desperation of Japanese leaders, but the result was devastating. Civilian casualties multiplied, and stories of entire families caught in the crossfire emerged in the days following the battle. The war had blurred the lines between heroes and victims, plunging humanity to its lowest point. On the 30th day of June, Lieutenant General Ushijima made a final decision. Acknowledging that organized resistance had collapsed, he prepared for ritual suicide, known as seppuku, a practice that symbolized the dishonor of defeat. With him, Divisional General Isamu Cho also chose the path of honor. In his last moments, Ushijima wrote a message to his emperor, expressing his loyalty and his wish that his sacrifice would serve as an example of Japanese determination. As the Kiamu Peninsula fell into American hands, the glow of fire and destruction lit up the sky. The American troops, although victorious, faced the harsh reality of what they had witnessed. The collapse of Japanese resistance not only marked the end of a battle, but also the crumbling of the ideals for which many had fought. The memories of the struggle, betrayal, and sacrifice would be etched in the collective memory of those who survived. The Battle of Okinawa officially culminated on the 2nd of July, 1945. But the price paid was incalculable. It is estimated that more than 200,000 civilians, Japanese and American soldiers, lost their lives. The island was devastated, marked by the scars of war. Okinawa had become a symbol of the brutality of the conflict and the fragility of human life. The fall of Okinawa was not only a military triumph for the United States, but also a chilling reminder of the horrors of war. As the world approached the conclusion of World War II, the legacy of Okinawa would become a point of reflection on the cost of conflict and the lessons that needed to be learned for the future. The tragedy that unfolded on the island would resonate through generations to come, reminding that, even in victory, the true price of war is the loss of life, dignity, and humanity itself. The cost of victory. Final reflections. During the 82 days of the Battle of Okinawa, which extended from April to June of 1945, The cost of victory became evident on all fronts. This conflict, which pitted the armed forces of the United States against the Japanese Empire, became one of the bloodiest episodes of World War II. Approximately 110,000 Japanese soldiers lost their lives, along with more than 12,000 American soldiers. However, the true cost of the battle transcends the figures of military casualties. The civilian population of Okinawa bore the most devastating weight of the war's horror. It is estimated that between 40,000 and 120,000 civilians lost their lives, caught in a crossfire they did not choose. The testimonies of those who lived on the island during the battle reveal the magnitude of the devastation. A female survivor, recalling the bombings, described how her neighbors were consumed by fire, while others sought refuge in caves, trying to escape the rain of projectiles. "It was like being in hell," she said, evoking the despair and chaos that surrounded her. The battle transformed the landscape of Okinawa. The rice fields, which had sustained generations, became a scene of destruction, covered in rubble and bodies. The brutality of the fighting, with its indiscriminate use of artillery and airstrikes, left a legacy of desolation that fractured not only the infrastructure of the island, but also the social and cultural fabric of its community. The psychological impact of the battle was felt on both sides. For many American soldiers, mostly young recruits, the experience of Okinawa marked a before and after in their lives. The descriptions of their experiences are chilling. One soldier, in a letter to his family, recounted the horror of seeing his comrades fall and the constant anxiety that accompanied him with each explosion. "One cannot forget what we have seen," he confessed, acknowledging that the images of the battle would haunt him forever. The psychological pressure and trauma of war led to an increase in cases of post-traumatic stress disorder among veterans, a phenomenon that was just beginning to be understood at that time. For Japan, the cost of the Battle of Okinawa was equally devastating. It was not only about the loss of lives, but also about the fall of a strategic stronghold considered a symbol of resistance. The resistance of the Japanese forces in Okinawa translated into a desperate effort to maintain control, at an unacceptable cost to the civilian population. The strategy of the military leaders, who urged civilians to fight and not surrender, resulted in unimaginable suffering. The atrocities committed during the battle, including mass suicides on the coast, reflect the desperation of a population caught between two fires. The brutality of Okinawa profoundly influenced the decision to use the atomic bomb in Japan. As American forces advanced toward the heart of the Japanese archipelago, military leaders contemplated a large-scale invasion that could cost up to 1 million American casualties. In this context, the use of the atomic bomb was presented as an alternative to avoid further human losses and accelerate the end of the war. This decision, however, was not without controversy. The memory of the horrors of Okinawa, coupled with the desire to avoid a prolonged invasion, entwined in a logic that justified the use of a weapon of mass destruction. The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 sealed Japan's fate and left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the nation. The effects of the explosions, which caused the instant death of tens of thousands of people, and the agony of the survivors, became a grim reminder of the decisions made in the heat of war. The devastation of the Japanese cities not only marked the end of the conflict, but also raised ethical questions about war and human sacrifice that would resonate in the decades to come. Okinawa, after the war, transformed into a symbol of peace and reconciliation, although its history is marked by pain and suffering. The American occupation, which lasted until 1972, left a lasting impression on the island and its population. The American military bases, which still remain in Okinawa, are a constant reminder of the war and its aftermath. The relationship between the United States and Japan, which went from being a deadly antagonism to a strategic alliance, is complex and nuanced. As both countries moved towards modernity, the memory of Okinawa became a reference point in the construction of their national identity. In modern Okinawa, the memory of the battle endures in the collective consciousness. Monuments, museums, and memorial ceremonies honor the fallen and preserve the history of those dark days. Okinawa Prefecture has adopted the motto, "Remember the war, choose peace," a call to future generations to reflect on the cost of war and the importance of peace. The stories of those who lived on the island during the battle are passed down from generation to generation, ensuring that the sacrifice of thousands is not forgotten. The cost of victory in Okinawa is a reminder that wars are not only won or lost on the battlefield. Their impact resonates across generations. The brutality of the struggle, the decisions made in moments of crisis, and the repercussions felt long after the bullets have stopped flying are lessons that continue to be taught in classrooms and discussed in contemporary forums. The Battle of Okinawa was not only a chapter of World War II, it was a milestone in the history of humanity, a reminder of the fragility of peace and the incalculable cost of conflict. In this sense, Okinawa remains a testament to human resilience and the endless quest for peace in a world marked by war.